thank you all for coming today to the commemoration for Dr. Robert Vaughan. Robert was born in Rhuddlan in North Wales on the 13th of February 1885, son of Thomas and Annie Vaughan. Thomas was a preacher, he was a vicar, and he preached in both Welsh and English. He'd only just recently been installed as the parish priest of St Mary's, Rhuddlan, when Robert was born. He'd been there for a few months. Robert already had a couple of elder sisters, but he was the only son in the Vaughan family. He, as a vicar's son, did all the things that vicar's sons are supposed to do. So he attended many church events, and we have records of him helping to decorate the church for Harvest Festival and helping out at bring and buy sales and all those sorts of things. He went to Epworth College, which used to stand in Rhyl, in North Wales. It's now a Welsh language middle school. And he boarded there and then went on to Rossall School in Lancashire. The school had been established for sons of the clergy, and there were several other sons of vicars and various other denominations of church officials in the intake that joined at the same time as him. He was there between the ages of about 8 and 13. And he didn't really feature, unusually for any of our men that attended these public schools, he doesn't seem to have featured in any sports teams, apart from a couple of appearances for the B team, the cricket team. He went on to university after school. He spent a year at Liverpool University. They have no record of what he was doing there, or even of him attending, but we know he went. He was probably preparing for further studies that he was going to undertake down in London, at University College London. And he matriculated there in the summer of 1903. And he went to study medicine at the medical school there. He was there for 3 years. He was a gifted student. Although he never won any prizes in his junior academic career, it would have been quite embarrassing actually, because his mum and dad handed out the prizes at prize giving at Epworth College. It would have been a bit of nepotism perhaps if they were handing them out to their son. But he did win a gold medal for pharmacology when he was at university, being the student with the highest mark in that particular subject. He had a year residency at Cardiff Infirmary. He learned the practical aspects of a doctor's trade there, as well as dealing with all the usual ailments. He also involved in several cases which were reported in the paper, where he was a witness, an expert witness at various different inquests, including a child that burnt to death, a various number of several freak accidents, and a man that died of an ulcer, for example, and the consequences of Cardiff's vibrant nightlife as well, several cases of assault and people in hospital as a result of that. After his year in Cardiff, and he gained his medical qualifications fully, and he came to Baptised to work at the asylum. Now, the asylum had been founded in the late 1870s. It was always big, but it grew over the years. And at the time that he joined, it had a capacity of over 2,000 patients, roughly 50-50 male and female, in many vast H-shaped dormitory blocks. And the patients there spent a lot of their time in occupational therapy. They weren't just locked away all day. So they'd spend their days out in the airing courts between the buildings. Even in the dead of winter, there'd be hundreds of patients out there in the morning and the afternoon, but also at work. So every day, about at least half of the male patients there were working, and they were out on the asylum's own farm. It was pretty much self-sufficient. So they were out on the farm, working in the fields, or helping on the wards, or working in the various different workshops with the upholsterer and the tailor and the shoemakers, working in the kitchens, washing vegetables, helping the bakers, all those sorts of tasks, and even out maintaining the asylum's cricket pitch. There were lots of recreational activities for the inmates at the asylum. They had football matches outside on the football pitch where hundreds of patients would come out to watch. They played cricket every day of the summer from May onwards, and they were even allowed to leave the grounds sometimes. The trusted patients would be allowed to wander around outside the asylum walls, or even go on trips down into Sutton. And small groups of patients were taken on day trips locally to places like Box Hill, or were allowed out to visit their friends. Robert was one of 5 assistant medical officers working under a medical superintendent there. They weren't there necessarily to treat the psychiatric ailments that the patients were suffering from, but just to look after them from a practical applied medicine point of view. They were a vulnerable medical population. They were not in peak physical condition, many of them, suffering from various different ailments. And of course, they're at risk of quite a lot of self-harm happening, patients having fits, for example, falling or lashing out, hitting objects, cutting their hands and panes of glass, and also hitting each other sometimes as well. And of course, when those patients had to be restrained, there were injuries as a result of that. So every day there were cases that the junior medical officers like Robert had to attend to. Their overall condition seems to have been pretty good. There were no, or very few cases of bed sores in the hospital, so the patients were well looked after. But there were deaths regularly, particularly among the elderly or the infirm patients. We commemorated a few weeks ago Reginald Moyes, an example of someone who was terminally ill with dementia, and of course there must have been many cases like that to be dealt with. It was a well-paid job. He earned about 3 times what the asylum attendants were earning just for his first position there. But promotion was slow. It was only really through dead men's shoes because there were so few medical officers looking after such a big population. He did get his first and only promotion a couple of years after he joined there, which brought a pay rise of £50 up to £220 a year. Pretty good salary. When war broke out, Robert enlisted in the Royal Army Medical Corps. So in August 1914 he was made lieutenant and he joined 14 General Hospital. Now, in the army at the time, and still now I guess, hospitals and ambulances weren't buildings and vehicles, they were medical units, medical staff. And number 14 General Hospital consisted of about 150 men, plus hospital equipment. Now, they were sent out to France, or to Belgium, in the autumn of 1914. And they sailed in October aboard the SS Palm Branch. And their first destination was Ostend on the Belgian coast. And they arrived there intending to disembark and set up a hospital, but refugees were flooding into town because the Germans were advancing rapidly, and the men were told that they must remain on the ship. Robert could see the refugees in the town. He wrote letters to his uncle in Wales, and for some time he seems to have been sort of almost like an unofficial foreign correspondent for one particular paper in Wales until the censorship kicked in and they shut it down. And he talked of German planes coming overhead and dropping bombs within a couple of hundred yards of their ship as they waited in harbour. So after 2 days there, they sailed off and they sailed down the coast to Boulogne to await further orders. And when they arrived there, after waiting around for a while, they were sent down to Calais. And they got to Calais, they disembarked, and they got their equipment out to set up in a school, a boarding school, to establish an English hospital there. But they were then approached by a French officer who informed them that there were to be no English hospitals in Calais and that they were to go back to their boat. And so they were sent back, and they waited around in harbour for 3 days for more orders to be sent wherever the army needed them. And they sailed back up to Boulogne a few days later and disembarked there. It took all day to get all their equipment off their boats and load it up onto trains for a short 3-mile journey up along the coast to Wimereux. They had found a hotel, the Hotel Splendid, and a casino which were going to be converted into a 300-bed hospital. The hotel was given over to treating officers. I've not found a photo of the inside of that hotel, but there are many of these luxurious, fashionable hotels converted into hospitals, and you can see the photos of them. They really do look, well, splendid, I suppose, as the hotel was called Splendid. These fabulous Edwardian, late Victorian interiors, so high ceilings and potted palms all over the place and luxurious carpets, and just rows and rows of beds of officers all looking relaxed in there. So they cleared out all the gaming tables from the casino. They started work at about 10 in the morning. And by the evening, they were in business and they had their first patients coming in. About 250 men arrived at 7 o'clock. It was a 300-bed hospital, as I say. Within 4 days, they had nearly 800 patients to treat. Now, their job, as Robert described it, was to patch them up and put them on a boat to England. Many of the lightly wounded arrived there, just got bored and merely wandered off into town because there were so few military police around at the time. So there was quite a chaotic atmosphere with men wandering off and you didn't know where they were, and batches of people coming in every few hours or so. The hospital became quite sophisticated. I mean, they took over what were in effect makeshift premises, but they were building things like X-ray rooms, pathology laboratories, and it became quickly a permanent installation for them. They actually remained there for the rest of the war. Now, Robert didn't though. When war had broken out, there was quite an extraordinary movement back home, on the home front, of people wanting to help, wanting to volunteer their services, not to join the army, but to help particularly the people of Belgium as much as they could. And there were many Red Cross-style organisations cropping up all over the place to help them send medical supplies over to France. And one of those was established in late 1914, early 1915, by a lady who'd been the secretary of the Union of Trained Nurses, the first professional nursing organisation. And she wanted to set up a hospital to help the Belgians or help the French. And in the end, they determined that they were going to create an urgency cases hospital, a trauma hospital, for French soldiers. So they negotiated with the French government to help them, because the French were quite prickly about these sorts of things, and they wanted to, quite rightly, do everything for their own men themselves. So they negotiated that this unit would only be staffed by trained medical professionals and trained nurses, and they would work under the direct command of the French army, but they'd be allowed quite a lot of wiggle room to treat the patients in the way that they saw fit. And the French secured them a wing of a hospital for them to use as a medical facility. And so 50 medical staff, including Robert, many volunteers from the Royal Army Medical Corps and from the civilian medical establishment, sailed, well, Robert was probably already in France, but the rest of them sailed over to France between January and March of 1915. The building that the French had found for them was near Verdun. Verdun had been the scene of intense fighting between the French and the Germans, would continue to be the scene of intense fighting for years afterwards. And it formed a salient into a bit that stuck out into the German line, which is why it was so hotly contested. The hospital that the French had found for them was about 30 miles away on the main road into Verdun. And the road was blocked day and night, nose to tail, with men going to the battle and casualties coming back from the battle. It was too far from the front line, really, to be an effective trauma hospital. Men needed to be with them within hours or within the hour for preference. And that wasn't going to happen, even though they had permission to go onto the battlefield and take casualties directly themselves. They very, very often wouldn't be able to do that. They were too far from the battlefield. And so they decided that they'd actually specialise in healing broken bones instead. So Robert worked as a surgeon, spent almost all day probably in theatre. They had many, many cases. They treated over 1,000 cases in their first few months. And he had about 40 fatalities, actually, which shows the standard of medical care that they were able to give that far from the front line. He worked day and night in the operating theatre with nurses alongside him. One of them, at least one of them, had left a diary describing just how the sheer tiring effect that it had, just being on your feet all day, looking after his men, as well as the psychological trauma of having to look after these wounded men. He was there for several months, and they moved eventually. The French wanted that wing of their hospital back, so they moved eventually to an old chateau by a mirror. It's called Chateau Le Faux Miroir, the false mirror, probably named after the reflections in the lake in front of it. And they set up these huts outside as wards for the men, and the medical staff were billeted in the chateau itself. It was shortly after the move there, and shortly before the Battle of Verdun itself began, that Robert actually left that medical unit. He volunteered for another duty, another people that needed help. The British saw the Belgians and the Serbians in the same light, really. Small countries fighting against oppressors, greatly in danger from them, not just from the soldiers, but from all kinds of medical ailments. And so several relief expeditions were organised to Serbia, and Robert volunteered with one of those. And he went out there with the Red Cross. They arrived in the autumn of 1915, about the same time that our troops arrived there. Serbia had come through the opening of the war relatively unscathed. They fought off several German attacks and were holding their line until Bulgaria entered the war in the summer of 1915. And all of a sudden, an entire side of their country, which had been safe, was now vulnerable. Now that they were in this vulnerable position, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians invaded from the north, and very soon the Bulgarians started invading from the east in a pincer movement. And the Serbian forces were pushed back and eventually forced out of their own country and retreated to the Adriatic and were shipped off to Corfu. We had sent troops there to try and forestall this, but they really arrived too late. And by the time they were approaching the Serbian border, they had to turn back to the port of Salonika in Greece. But the civilian volunteers didn't turn back. They stayed. And they were there to help civilians and to help refugees in particular. And so there were many medical establishments in southern Serbia at the time which were catering to help these very vulnerable, very needy people. One doctor said that it was like a medical textbook come to life. All the things that you would take for granted that you wouldn't see in England, you'd see there. Virtually every ailment you could think of. They actually were very lucky to go there just after an epidemic of typhus had subsided. That was one of the reasons why we were late arriving. We were holding back our troops to prevent them being infected from the Austro-Hungarian prisoners. It would have been absolutely devastating. Mortality rates were sky high for that. They were bad enough anyway. They were something like 70% mortality rates, both for patients and for medical staff. It was a dangerous place to be, just purely from other ailments. So Robert was in Monastir in southern Serbia. The Bulgarians arrived about a month or so after he did. He was amongst some of the last people to leave that town, evacuated, probably with the last batch of Serbian troops who withdrew to prevent any unnecessary bloodshed in the town. And the British Vice-Consul praised his self-sacrificing devotion to duty while Robert was working in that town. They retreated just 20 miles or so into the comparative safety of northern Greece, to the town of Florina. And Greece was neutral at that time. It was split though. The government were pro-Central Powers, wanted to come in on the side of Germany, and the Prime Minister was pro-Allied and wanted to come in on the side of Britain and France. So Salonika in northern Greece and Macedonia was something of a safe haven for the Allied troops. They'd landed there, they'd established a beachhead there around the town of Salonika. But that was back at the coast, and Florina was in between that relative safety of that camp and the approaching Bulgarian forces. So there was about a 20-mile, 25-mile wide no man's land, and Florina, this town, was in the middle of that. It was flooded with Serbian refugees at the time, all in a pitiable state. Winter was coming. That particular part of northern Greece is very vulnerable to blizzards coming down the Vardar Valley, and it was going to be a long, hard winter for all concerned. But Robert worked throughout that winter to help the people in need in that town. Always at his element, helping people, always thinking of others and looking to see what he could do to help them. He also did some work, aside from his medical work, he did some work, we don't know what, but something for the Serbian government as well while he was there. In the spring of 1916, the Greek government surrendered a key fortress to the Bulgarians, and that presaged an invasion by Bulgaria of Greece itself. So, to forestall that, the Allies pushed out from the port of Salonika, and they came back past Florina and took the town, secured the town, and for a few weeks at least, Robert was in a safer position than he had been for a while. But then Bulgaria invaded the country in August, and they pushed through quite rapidly through the Serbian forces that were defending Florina. And Robert once more had to pack up and leave, and he was pulled back to the port of Salonika. At this point, he'd seen enough of the consequences of the aggression of the Central Powers, and he decided that he was going to do something more directly about it. And he decided that he was going to join the Royal Artillery. He returned home to England, and in the autumn of 1916, he enlisted as a gunner. He joined the Royal Field Artillery at their No. 4 depot at Woolwich in the middle of November, and went, after completing his basic training there, he was assigned to a reserve battery at Larkhill Camp on Salisbury Plain. During that time there, the family suffered a tragedy. One of his sisters lost her husband in a motorbike accident in December. And then just 3 short months later, Robert lost his father to a seizure. Robert was about to be posted to the British Expeditionary Force at the time. In fact, he probably should have even been on the boat at that time. But he had managed to attend his father's funeral in Rhuddlan. It was the last time that he would see his family, because maybe even later that same day or the next day, he was on the boat to France. He was with the Royal Field Artillery as a gunner, but he wasn't on a battery. He was assigned to No. 3 Division's ammunition column. The job of the ammunition column was to keep the batteries supplied with shells and keep the infantry supplied with small arms ammunition. So the Army Service Corps in their lorries would drive tons and tons of shells to a big dump a few miles from the front line, and then the ammunition column would move it to a dump much nearer the front line, and then the batteries would drive down themselves in their horse-drawn wagons and cart shells up to their guns. Now Robert arrived just as the Battle of Arras was about to start, this diversionary attack that we made to help the great French offensive along the River Aisne. And at the time he joined, the dump that the ammunition column was maintaining was about 5 miles behind the front line, nice and safe. The guns, the bombardment that opened up at the start of the Battle of Arras was the greatest bombardment we'd seen so far in the war, much greater weight of shell than had been seen on the Somme. Each group of 3 18-pounder and 1 4.5-inch howitzer batteries were firing well in excess of 7,000 shells a day each. The ammunition column that Robert was part of were keeping almost 40,000 shells on hand for distribution to them. And it must have been a never-ending job, particularly during that first week-long bombardment, ferrying shells from the dump far behind the lines up to that ammunition refilling point nearer the lines. The first day of the Battle of Arras was a great success. The No. 3 Division supported one of our baptised men that we've already commemorated, Alan Guest and his Royal Fusiliers, as they advanced successfully to their objectives around the village of Tilloy. But after that first day and that great advance, the greatest that had been seen from a standing start during the war, things went the way that they always seem to do. The attacks broke down, they came to a halt short of their final objectives. There was an attempt to restart that, Second Battle of the Scarpe, a couple of weeks later, by which time the guns had moved up closer to the line. A new dump was established in one of the caves under Arras, and another one by the village of Tilloy. After that attempt to restart failed, and we commemorated 2 men that fell in that attempt, another attempt was launched on the 3rd of May. The Third Battle of the Scarpe, which has been called the blackest day the British Army had to endure during the First World War. It was conceived in haste, confusion reigned on the ground, the attack was made in the dark, the men over unfamiliar ground, the men didn't know where they were going, they didn't know what their objectives were. There wasn't very much in the way of artillery preparation on that occasion. And about 6,000 men lost their lives that day, mostly unnecessarily and for no gain at all. And that marked almost the official end of the Battle of Arras. But actions carried on in that area for the next few weeks or so. Now, Douglas Haig had taken his eye off Arras. It was clear that the breakthrough wasn't going to happen there. The breakthrough wasn't going to happen on the French attack either, because the French army had fallen apart in the face of a very stiff German defence, and they were actually mutinying at the time. And they were spent as an offensive force for the rest of the war. And so Douglas Haig turned his attentions north to the Channel coast of Belgium. He wanted to retake those Belgian ports. But while they were preparing to do that, and they were preparing for the army to move north to be replaced by French troops, they carried on trying to improve their position and to take those objectives that they hadn't quite reached yet. And one of the last of those attacks was on the 11th of May, when in front of the village of Monchy-le-Preux, which stood on this spur between the Scarpe and the Courgeot rivers, the trench that ran over Infantry Hill, called Toul Trench, was the object. And the attack was a great success. It was conceived as a surprise attack. The artillery were given very specific instructions that they were to bombard them, but don't make it seem like you're bombarding them, kind of thing. And so there was no signal, there was no obvious sign to the Germans that an attack was about to come. And we succeeded in capturing that trench. It was helped out very fortuitously, perhaps by one action more than any other, which was just as a German machine gunner had rows of advancing British troops in his sight. He was hit around the head with a spade by a British machine gunner who had arrived just in time and probably saved hundreds of lives and made the attack a success. The position wasn't completely captured though, and there were operations ongoing to secure the rest of that trench. And that was what the guns of Robert's division were doing at the time. They were protecting this trench and trying to help capture the area around it. On the 22nd of May, a few days after that, Robert was wounded. He was fatally wounded somewhere near Tilloy. We don't know what he was doing at the time. There was an ammunition refilling point, which he would have been at or near anyway in the course of his duties at Tilloy. It was out of the range of most German guns, but it must have been a shell that hit him. There is a remote possibility that he was attached to a battery of 3rd Division at the time as a gunner. One of his obituaries, just one, says that he was with his guns when they were firing when he was hit, but I'm not sure that's true. One battery was quite heavily shelled that day. He was evacuated for treatment, but he died 100 years ago today, just a few hours after being wounded. He was 32 years old. He's not commemorated here at all. He's one of Banstead's forgotten men, really. I don't understand why some men that lived and worked at the asylum are commemorated in our book here and some men aren't, but he's not one of those names. But he is probably the most commemorated man that we have, and he's on memorials at all of his schools and colleges except for Liverpool University, and he's on a number of memorials in Rhuddlan and in North Wales as well. So he is not forgotten.